Round two of the Stanley Cup Playoffs is set for most of the field. How do those matchups play out? Plus, there's only one game seven so far, and one of those big coaching carousel spots is gone. All of that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone, and thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner from Locked On Flyers. I'm here each and every Friday with Gil Martin of Locked On Islanders. You can find the show over on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to get the latest episode as soon as it's available here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by the Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. You can turn any TV into your Xbox, no console needed. Head to amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to learn more. Gil, how are we doing this Friday?
We are doing. Round one is starting to wind down, and round one is my favorite round. As a fan, if my team is not involved, it's the best. So many games, you're switching around, one right.
No emotional baggage. It's great.
Just enjoy the quality hockey, It was great. It's great.
Yeah. Very interesting, though. Right now we only have one guaranteed game seven. That, of course, is between the Colorado Avalanche and Dallas Stars after the Avs won game six in that series last night in a very back and forth game with questionable goaltending. But I think that it's interesting because, again, both of the potential game sevens, we do know the Jets Blues series could go to game seven. Game six is tonight, with the Jets having a shot at closing out that series. But both of those are in the same corner of the bracket.
Yeah, they are. So it's a lot of unknowns in that particular part of the bracket right now.
Yeah. And of course, as we know, they reseed. And so, we're not sure what's going on with that section of the playoffs. But we do know that the entire Eastern Conference kind of got their ducks in a row, so to speak, even though the Ducks play in the West. We'll forgive that line there. But I think, it is interesting that we are going to see the Washington Capitals and Carolina Hurricanes in round two. And I mentioned goaltending in the previous series. I feel like goaltending has been such a narrative in these playoffs so far, and that's going to be no different in this series, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And we've seen, I think, a lot more high scoring games in this playoff so far than I anticipated. Usually you get a lot of 2-1s and 3-2s. We're getting 6-4, 7-5. I mean, I'm waiting for Coffey and Curry and Gretzky. I mean, this is like 80s hockey all over again.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Now, we do know that for the Washington Capitals, Logan Thompson went 4-1 in the first round, a 2.23 goals against average, a 923 save percentage, and excellent performance. There was that slight scare with the injury when Dylan Strome ran into him. So Charlie Lindgren went in for a while. He only allowed a goal on 4 shots. So I feel like, of course, they want Logan Thompson to play it out, but that the Caps do have a decent enough backup should something happen with Thompson again.
They do. And, depth for goaltending is important. A, you don't want to wear your starter out entirely. And B, injuries happen in this game, and you need to have somebody ready to step in, even if it's for 5 minutes. You give up 3 goals in 5 minutes. That's the game. That changes the momentum of the series even potentially. So you may only need your backup once or twice, but sometimes that's a very important once or twice.
Yeah, and that is a huge factor for the Carolina Hurricanes in this series as well, because as we know, Freddie Anderson, we don't know what his current status is as of now and if he'll be able to return. He left in game 4 of their first round series against the New Jersey Devils. Peter Kochetkov won game 5 to clinch the series. But goaltending turbulence, I'd say, has been a hallmark of this Carolina Hurricanes team for what seems like forever, right?
Yeah, it always seems like they're trying to figure out their goaltending situation. And it's not that they don't have good goalies, but I don't know if they've had a dominant goalie. They've had hot goalies sometimes. But,
Right.
there's always two guys fighting to see who's going to be the number one guy. And it just injuries and slumps and streaks. It goes back and forth. And curiously enough, Carolina has always been a contender, but is yet to get all the way over the hump, so to speak. And maybe the goaltending has something to do with that. Even though it's uniformly good, it's not outstanding.
Yeah, and I just think this is going to be an interesting matchup just because we do have that veteran presence and a bunch of guys who did already win a Stanley Cup with the Washington Capitals on that side. And of course, we have Alex Ovechkin wanting to cap off a tremendous season with the goals record. We have like a which Tom Wilson is going to show up today question to answer that has continued. And I think, the emergence of Connor McMichael as a genuine star on that team. And can he step it up in the playoffs in a way that, he doesn't have as much experience as the other guys on that Capitals team?
He doesn't, but he's surrounded by people who do. And I think
Yeah.
that can make his acclimation to playoff hockey that much faster. He doesn't need to be the guy. And he's going to learn, even just by osmosis, by example, from guys like Ovechkin who have been there and done that. So I think he's in a very good spot considering his age and his experience level. That's where you want to be. You learn from the best and you take it from there.
Yeah, and I think this series is going to be a lot about discipline as well. I think that it's not just about like taking penalties discipline. I think it's defensive structural discipline because we know like Carolina plays like a faster, looser game than Washington does. And I think that the Caps are going to have a strong defensive structure and back check a lot and a lot faster in this series in order to prevent the Canes from having multiple opportunities in the offensive zone.
Yeah, they're a fast team and they are coming at you. So, and I think for Carolina, there is sort of an advantage in that the style they play is conducive to playoff hockey all year long. So,
Right.
they're not adjusting their game the way some teams have to get into playoff mode. I think Carolina is pretty much in playoff mode 82 games
Yes,
during the regular
they
season.
are.
Yeah.
They are. Yeah, I know. That's what I think like the coaching duel here and the matchups. I just think this is going to be a really interesting series and I think a thinking fans series in a lot of ways. But then it could also immediately go off the rails. And that's why I like it in a lot of ways because you can probably get a little of both here.
You can get that dash of the unknown, of the daring, of the physicality. And yet, I kind of anticipate, like, this is a series where both of these teams just have so much to prove.
I know.
And, I mean, if I'm Carolina, I'm just sick of not meeting those expectations in the playoffs. And if I'm the Capitals, certainly, you want to prove the regular season is no fluke. You want to, like you said, cap off Alexander Ovechkin's outstanding record-setting season. It is
And make it so that season wasn't just about that
right,
this is a good
exactly.
team, which again, to your point, we know they are based on the regular season record, but was it partially the goals record motivation that got them there? Like, can they go beyond that? And I think that's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question, and we're going to find out the answer over the next few weeks when these two teams go head to head. And It's going to be a great series. It really, really is.
I think so too, and I'm looking forward to seeing, like, if Svechnikov and Sebastian Aho can, like, continue the success that they had, because that Devils team was broken, right?
Yeah.
And so to have to switch gears and go up against a much stronger team that's in a much better shape, like, that is a difficult thing to do. So I am very curious to see how the Canes can, like, take it up a notch in the next series, when I think even though we know that Montreal is a team that's just getting going in their kind of playoff eligible run here, they're young, they're fast, and so I think the Caps had a really good competition to compare in the first round, whereas I don't know that the Canes did, and I'm interested to see if that has an effect.
I am too. And, that could cut two ways. On the one hand, you could say, okay, now they have to flip the switch and
Mhm.
rise up that intensity level. On the other hand, if you're going to win a Stanley Cup, you kind of need one series that's a little less intense at some point. You want to win a series 4-0 or 4-1, so it's not so much of a grind. Maybe, that opening series for Carolina was that series that was a little easier. No offense to the Devils. They just had so many injuries. They weren't even themselves by the time the playoffs started.
Yeah. Well, speaking of 4-1, there was a series between the Toronto Maple Leafs and Florida Panthers that ended that way a couple of years ago. They are going to have a rematch, and we're going to talk about them coming up next.
Did you know that your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe or sign in to the Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to go. Dive into hundreds of premium titles, including EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty, as easily as you stream your favorite shows. Do you ever find yourself flipping between apps to find one place that just works? With Fire Stick TV 4K, everything is in one place, from Netflix to YouTube and beyond. So head to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. It's available on select devices, including Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd Gen, Fire TV Stick 4K Max 1st and 2nd Gen, Fire TV Cube 3rd Gen, Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. Check it out today.
The Florida Panthers versus the Toronto Maple Leafs. Where have we heard this before? Of course, it was in the 2023 Stanley Cup playoffs in the second round, where, as we recall, Toronto fans were begging to play the Florida Panthers and were rooting for them against the Boston Bruins in that first round series that went to 7 games. Toronto got their wish and faced the Florida Panthers, and then promptly lost the series 4-1, as I
Yeah.
mentioned
Be careful what you
earlier.
wish for, right?
Exactly. So now, though, I feel like there's definitely a different energy here. Toronto, of course, defeated the Ottawa Senators in 6 games. Florida, I think, surprising a lot of people, eliminated the Tampa Bay Lightning in 5 games here. And I think that people expected that series to be a little bit closer than it was. And a lot of people picked the Lightning, myself included, to win that series, because we weren't sure, what this Florida team was with the injuries and the suspensions and all of that. And I think that when you are the defending Stanley Cup champion and you made it to the final the previous year as well, in that infamous year, I feel like, there's a certain respect and a certain ability to just get the job done that maybe people underestimated with Florida.
The experience counts. And the Florida Panthers, look, 10 years from now, Florida Panthers fans are going to look back at these 3 seasons and like, oh, these were the best days. These were the good old days for our team. And, this team knows how to win. And going out and beating Tampa Bay as soundly as they did, not that the games themselves were necessarily easy, but I don't think too many people expected this series to be 5 games. And I got to give credit to the Florida Panthers because they did coalesce and come together and just really take it up a notch in the playoffs. And I think the experience has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, you want to say that this is a little bit of a rematch, even though it was 2 years ago. And there's some things that are the same about both these teams and some things that are different. I think, again, goaltending comes to mind. Same for Florida with Sergei Bobrovsky in net. And, if you look at the head to head between these two teams during the regular season, Bob was 3-1-0, a 1.77 goals against average, 925 save percentage. So Bob knows how to shut down this Toronto Maple Leafs team.
He does. And, on the flip side, I think Toronto is going to surprise some people in this series because people who don't watch the Maple Leafs a lot always think of the big four and they're an offensive team. This team can play defense, and this team is built for the playoffs, I think, more than any previous Maple Leafs team in the last, let's say, 10 years. So they're going to surprise some people with how tough and out they're going to be, or they're going to pull off the upset. I just think people will assume that the Leafs are always going to find a way to lose in the playoffs, and it's not going to be that simple.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And that's one of the lessons that Toronto learned from that series loss 2 years ago is they started shifting their mindset a little bit when building the team. And, I think with goaltending, they still have had that problem of finding the exact right goaltender, but Anthony Stolarz has stepped up for this team. I think, if you look at round one, he went 4-2, a 2.21 goals against average, 901 save percentage. So obviously not as good as Bob, but it was certainly enough to carry him through that series against Ottawa. And I think, in a lot of ways, Ottawa had the experience to try to get around the Leafs goaltending in a way that was just something we knew going into there. So I think that Stolarz actually getting that experience in that series is going to carry through to this next round a little bit better here. I think, the cores of both these teams is pretty similar to what it was 2 years ago. But to your point, the style of play of Toronto has changed a little bit. I think that'll be a big deal. The only thing that's interesting is the Aaron Ekblad suspension, not the original big suspension, but the little suspension for the Hagel hit. This guy, man. At any rate, he'll be out for game one because he still has to serve that second game. And that'll certainly open up some doors for the Leafs.
It will. And, he's such an important part of the Panthers' success, and having him out of the lineup changes the dynamic of that team. It changes the power play. It changes. He plays a lot of minutes. All of a sudden, everybody has to step up and do a little bit more than maybe you would want them to do if you were coaching this team. Play a different role slightly, take on more minutes. And I'll say this, if the game goes to overtime, that could have a big effect on the Florida Panthers.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think if you're looking at how the Florida Panthers have gotten here, it's been more of by committee, whereas the top guys in Toronto have been the ones to get the payoff here and be the high scorers. If you look at the top scorers in the playoffs overall, there's a couple of Leafs up there before you get to any Florida Panthers. There's 3, I think, Leafs before you get to any Florida Panthers, with Sam Reinhart having the most points by any Panther in the playoffs so far with only 6. And so, I think when you're winning by committee versus winning by your core, that's a different approach. And I think that's an interesting matchup to see.
It is. Now, keep in mind the Panthers played one less game. So
it's true, but still.
Yeah, no. Your point is valid. I'm just saying that there is that, in there. But yeah, I think, and the advantage of the committee approach is you could have a different person step up at any time. The
Mhm.
disadvantage is you don't know who it is going to be, and sometimes nobody steps up. Whereas if you're relying on your, four big superstars, the odds that one of those really elite players is going to step up, I think, can be higher.
Yeah, I think so. So again, I just think like the narrative around this series is extremely strong. I think the Leafs making it another round in the playoffs, I mean, let alone potentially getting to a Stanley Cup final. Now, I honestly think who's ever in the West is going to win, but that being said, I think like the pressure on this Leafs team to come out of this series with a win is extremely high. And it's just like, can they meet the moment?
Yeah. Yeah. And doing it against the defending Stanley Cup champions just adds to the mix. I am looking forward to this series.
I am too. Well, there's some other teams out there who aren't really thinking about the playoffs. They're thinking about who's going to be their new head coach. And one of them, the New York Rangers, have already made a decision in hiring former Pittsburgh Penguins coach, Mike Sullivan. We're going to talk about that and the coaching carousel in general coming up next. The Stanley Cup playoffs are in full swing, and if you've never been to a live NHL playoff game, it is unlike anything else. It's been a while for me, but I still remember what it's like. The intensity, the speed, the energy in the building, it is next level. And thanks to Game Time, getting in the door can be easier and more affordable than ever. Game Time is the fastest way to grab those playoff tickets, even for those must-see matchups. And prices actually drop as puck drop gets closer. And with those last minute deals, you can save up to 60% for sports, concerts, comedy, and my favorite, the theater. Their all in pricing shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. And the app even shows you panoramic sea views so you know exactly what you're getting before you buy. And with Game Time ticket coverage, I know I'm protected, whether it's cancellation protection, job loss assurance, or their 24-hour return guarantee. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code Locked On NHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, Mike Sullivan is now the head coach of the New York Rangers. That was a pretty quick decision
Yeah.
there, right?
They didn't have to think about it too long, did they?
No, not at all. And I think, that being decisive, I think has its advantages. I think, there's also an advantage to being a little slower and more deliberate and considering all the candidates and, considering candidates that are still in active playoff situations right now. I think, but if you know who your guy is, you know who your guy is. I think it's going to be interesting. There's a lot of like Metro division. There's like a mini carousel within the bigger carousel in the Metro division. How do you think that will affect things for the Rangers?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. The Flyers are looking for a coach. The Islanders are looking for a coach. And the Rangers, just like you said, they were decisive. Look, you can't argue with Sullivan's resume. Okay, the
No.
guy's won cups. He's coached star players. He's gotten the most out of them. Now, the last couple of years have been a little tough, but he hasn't had the talent to work with and the depth to work with that he did in the past.
Yeah, I just find it's really interesting that the Rangers just keep hiring other former Metro coaches.
Yeah,
Like they can't get out of the Metro.
it's a
And
habit,
it's just
right?
weird. It is really weird. And I think, there's speculation that John Tortorella, because of the close personal relationship with Mike Sullivan, he could potentially return to the Rangers in some capacity to work with Mike Sullivan. I think that would be certainly very interesting as well.
Yeah, well, look, Torts is never dull. You could love him, you could hate him. He's never dull. So it would be interesting to see him come back. I wonder what his relationship is like with ownership with the
Yeah.
Rangers, whether that would complicate things or not. But it would be very interesting if he were to come back in some capacity.
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be really interesting here. Right now we have 4 vacancies and 3 interims left in in the carousel here, because since the last time we added Vancouver to the mix, but now have subtracted the New York Rangers. So we're
Right.
still at 7 here. And speaking of those Canucks, Rick Tocchet is obviously perceived to be a top candidate for the Flyers job because he is a former Flyers player, but he's also a former Pittsburgh Penguin. So,
It's true.
I would not count him out. And I think for that job either. And I think it'll be interesting to see like what situation, because I feel like Rick Tocchet right now is in the driver's seat in terms of what kind of job he's looking for with what kind of roster. And I do think that it'll be interesting to see how that matchup comes into play, because I do think he will take a job for this next season. It's just a matter of where.
I think he will too. And the question is, like, where do you think he fits better? That his coaching style, is it more suited to the Flyers, or is it more suited to the Penguins, or somewhere else?
Somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because, we've got the Kraken job open. Like that could be enticing, for
talent,
a
yeah.
lot of reasons. Yeah. And I think, the Ducks job is an opportunity to build a team, and mold it to your own. Although I don't think that's what Tocchet in particular wants to do right now. But I think it's interesting. We know that there's a couple of college coaches that have been making the rounds. Pat Ferschweiler, who was the head coach or is the head coach of Western Michigan, who just won a national championship. We know that he talked to the Philadelphia Flyers and through Kevin Weeks, we got that information. And it's interesting because, he's going to get anything he wants. He's the king of the castle at Western Michigan. So it would take a lot for him to leave. But one of his top players literally just signed his contract with the Flyers. So there is that connection there. But, we also know about David Carl in Denver. But again, I don't think he's going anywhere either. I do also think there's a couple of top AHL coaches that could land somewhere that are still in playoff situations in the AHL. So I just think there's so many names out there right now that it's hard to say like where the next stop on the carousel is going to be, right?
It is tough. And I think it's a good thing that there are so many names out there. And I'll add, we still don't know from a New York Islanders perspective. They're looking for a new president and a new GM. Does the new GM retain Patrick Waugh or move on from him? So there could be another opening. It's sort of still up in the air on Long Island as well.
It is. And the other kind of asterisk I would add to that is I am very curious what happens in Tampa. Like, is John Cooper, like, is he done now? Like, I don't know that, like, he's an excellent coach and I have no beef with him as a coach, but he's the longest tenured coach in the NHL by a significant margin. And at some point, like, you just agree to part ways. Like, even if there's been a ton of success and there isn't necessarily anything wrong with the coaching, it's just like, is it time? And I just keep wondering if that's going to happen here.
Look, they still had a good season. They didn't do what they wanted to do in the playoffs. Obviously, this was a transition year after losing Stamkos, the heart and soul of that team, for a decade or so. But yeah, eventually there is a point where it's just time for a fresh perspective and a fresh voice. And I think we're getting close to that point. Whether we're there or not, well, decisions have to be made.
Right. And the other question that I have, which adds to that for me, is the Olympics and Team Canada. We know that John Cooper coached Team Canada in the Four Nations Cup to a win in that tournament. And would it be something that he would take a year off from NHL coaching, like leave Tampa, focus on Team Canada for the Olympics, maybe come out of it with a gold medal, and then go back to the NHL the following season?
Well, like, that's the ideal course, right? If he's going to do that, of course he could go to the Olympics, not medal at all, and then the whole thing blows up in his face. So
Listen, I just think it's a path that has a certain degree of logic to it.
It does. It really does.
And so it's just something that's been in the back of my mind ever since Four Nations. And now that Tampa's out of the playoffs, like it percolated a little bit more.
Yeah, if it's gonna happen, this is the time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, we'll keep riding that carousel and see where everybody lands, see if there's some more openings, see if interims become permanent. There's lots to follow up on there. And we here at Locked On NHL will cover all of that. That will do it for today's show. Gil, of course, will be back on Monday to talk with hosts from around the network about what's going on with their teams. And of course, we have Locked On NHL game night every day, every night until a Stanley Cup champion is crowned. You can get all the best local analysis on a national scale with NHL game night on Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts right here in this feed. I will be back tomorrow for the Women's Hockey Report with Erica L. Ayala. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of that season there and heading into the PWHL playoffs. So lots to talk about there as well. Have a great day, everyone.